We're back with the fourth part, Jewish people, the misunderstood passages. Um, I don't know why it's technically titled Jewish people. Um, now that I think about it. But I guess in the topic is who are the true Jews and what were the Jewish people's origins. So let's look at some misunderstood passages that are used to purport that the children of Israel, well, this black narrative that they were black people. We're going to get through some of this stuff here. So let's start with Lamentations chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. Let me get it bigger here. Here, how do we get to the fifth chapter? If we can zoom this in. No. Font size. Okay. This is an NIV version. Of course, we can get any version we want on here. I mean, we've been using the King James for the most part, so let's get the King James version here. Verse 9. We get our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of terrible famine. So here we have the cause, I'm sorry, the effect and the cause. And also here, the effect and the cause. Most people read this verse, they didn't read the verse above it. Oh, that's funny. I just listened to something a couple of hours ago on a YouTube video on biblical teaching where the man teaching said that he had heard from someone else teaching him not to read a verse, but to read other verses to get context. Don't just read a verse. Not that you don't read the Bible, but don't just read an isolated verse. So here we go. We got our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. So this is an off-quoted passage by those within the Black Hebrew Israelite groups as a proof text that Negro slaves brought to America and their descendants are the so-called true Jews. Most of them never quote verse 9, but verse 9 and verse 10 are similar, which I just showed you. So they both start with a statement and then gives a reason for that statement, quote unquote, because of. That simply indicates a reason or source. We got our bread with the peril of our lives, or we got our bread at the risk of our lives. And that is followed by a because of statement, meaning the preceding statement is true or happened because of what follows after that statement. In other words, if there were no sword in the wilderness, there would have been no risking of their lives, no peril of their lives when they tried to get bread. The reason their lives were at risk in getting bread during the time of famine was due to the sword that they faced in the wilderness. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. Or, in other words, if there were no terrible famine, their skin would not be black like an oven. What color the skin would be if the famine did not exist is not mentioned anywhere in the text. The book of Lamentations is a book written about the destruction of Jerusalem and what the prophet saw concerning the effect of Israel's sins on the nation. Israel was promised peril and famine, and they received it. Verse 10 is hardly a proof text at all for what the Black Hebrew Israelites believe. I don't think one tries to interpret a passage incorrectly on purpose, but oftentimes one doesn't have the best tools Other times, one reads their bias into a text, and as a result, they can make a text say what they wanted to say. Then there are those then there are those who purposely twist scriptures. A biased person will read their bias into a text. For example, I've seen it where one used the photos of healthy, dark skinned black models and compared it to the verses of Lamentations. In a way, it may even be regarded as being intellectually dishonest. A healthy person's skin color should not be compared to the skin color of those in a passage where it said the color of their skin was a result of famine. We're going to get to the point like, well, what does famine have to do with their skin color? The Israelites' black skin was like an oven was a result of the terrible famine in the land. So drawing conclusions otherwise is dishonest. Back in the 1840s, the people of Ireland were hoping for a good potato harvest, but instead, the summer of 1846 was cool and moist, and they had used diseased potatoes from the previous year's harvest as planters for this year's potato harvest. It caused diseased shoots to sprout, and the potato harvest was blight. It spread 50 miles each across the countryside and very rapidly destroyed every potato in Ireland. The land was in famine. Most of the people did not die from hunger itself, but from associated diseases: typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever, and famine dropsy. This was during an era of time that doctors were not able to provide a cure. Highly contagious black fever, as typhus was nicknamed since it blackened the skin, was spread by body lace and was carried from town to town by beggars and paupers. This is taken from the history place Irish Potato Famine. And here's the website here. Well, F3. No, can't F3 in this because this is pulling this up in separate part of this WordPress application. Okay, you can see here as it blackened the skin. There's some other articles on this. I actually did this video before, and did I put it up here? Oops. Oh, one of these websites, other websites talked about it. I just don't remember which one it was. This is the, I think this is the website. Yeah, this is the one we were. Here we go. Common myths about the Great Irish Potato Famine. Every, one of the common myths that they're talking about is that everyone starved to death during the Great Irish Famine. Not everyone who died during the famine starved to death. Some may have been extremely malnourished, but not actually starving. Extreme malnourishment weakens our bodies and our immune system, making us vulnerable to disease. Therefore, many died from diseases that their bodies could not fight due to their weakened condition. One of these diseases was typhus, which the Irish called the black fever due to the swollen and darkened faces of its victims. So here again, this article talks about how during the Great Irish Potato Famine, again, it reemphasizes that typhus was called, which the Irish called, the black fever, and the reason why they did that is because it darkened their faces, the faces of their victims. So this isn't something that we're making up. This actually happened in history. Typhus attacks the small black cells in the skin and brain, causing the vessels to swell and block circulation. When the blood vessels became so swollen that they burst, the victim's skin turned black. They took the black fever first between the two big toes, said Mary Nugent. It turned black and went up the foot and the legs and went up into the body. It turned as black as behind the fire till it killed them on their 2 feet in no time at all. This is a quote from The Black Potatoes, the story of the Great Irish Famine, 1845 to 1850, on page 95. This was written by Susan Campbell Bartoletti. So this is documented history that during famine, there was a time in famine in Ireland where typhus took over due to people's weakened immune systems, and it blackened Irish people's skin. Literally, what we call white people, or they're Caucasian people, started to have blackened skin because of a famine. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. So, I wanted to point that out, that this doesn't really a proof text that the children of Israel during the book of Lamentations, that scripture passage is not talking about the color of their skin due to their natural orientation of the skin. This is due to a particular condition and environment that they were under. Next proof text, Isaiah 29:22. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob. Jacob shall not now be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax pale. Does this text mean that Jacob used to be white? I mean, if you read a text without understanding, you can make this say that Isaiah prophesied that Jacob won't be white anymore. When it reads, Jacob shall not now be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax pale. Meaning it was pale, but now it won't be. But it's really just using an idiom, and this is written as a form of parallelism. These two parts are actually talking about the same thing. Wax pale is the same as being ashamed. That's just an idiom for the same meaning. I honestly believe that a majority of Israelites were of an olive complexion, but I understand that they all can't have the same complexion due to various intermarriages, which I discussed in the second installment, or the part 2, the Jews and their origins. And we talked about that, and I think we talked about that in part 3 as well, especially when you consider Israel in exile amongst the nations. Job said he was black. So we're going to pull up this video by Messenger of Truth. We're going to put the caps on, and we're not going to play the audio because I don't want to get.
All right, people. Number 3. I
Hopefully
wanted
has
to do
closed
this.
captions. It's going to concern black like an oven. Pure wool. I'm going to mention Paul as well. So this is a good video. You can watch this video. Messenger of Truth, Exposing Hebrew Israelites, part 3 of 3, Black Like an Oven. I wanted to give his take on that. On this blog post, I do have linked to at the bottom of more of his, because he has alternate view of some of the passages that I'm going over. I just a student. I'm just another disciple. I'm not like the arbitrator of truth. So I study. I share what I study. Other people do study too, and iron sharpens iron. You can learn from other people. Sometimes I will come across someone else's point of view, and I'll read it and study the scriptures, pray on it, and sometimes we come to the same conclusions, and other times we don't. But I just want you to share that. You can go watch that video. I don't deal with it myself in this text. All right, Moses' hand turned leprous as snow. Now look at these Caucasian people. Are they white as snow? Look, here's snow. Here's the Caucasians. Here's snow. Here's the Caucasians. White people are not white as snow. Anyways, So, could white people with leprosy turn white as snow? Possibly. I don't even know if, when the scriptures talk about as white as snow, what that really does it really mean as snow? I'm not certain. Or it actually doesn't say white as snow. It says leprous as snow. So I'm not sure what is leprous as snow. Spreading like snow is like a blanket on the ground. Maybe leprous is like a blanket over the skin. I'm not sure how they intended to be viewed here. But the Lord said furthermore unto him, put now thy hand into thy bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous as snow. Exodus 4:6. This is not a proof text. Moses could have been black, brown, red, olive complexion, could have been tanned, anything prior to the leprous event. He didn't have to be black. So this does not prove blackness. Could have been like these people and then turned leprous. If it's meaning snow. Caucasians do have tint to them, you guys. All right, my point isn't even that Moses was white. I have shown in prior articles the racial origins of the Hebrew people and how foreigners were added to the family of God as far back as when Abraham himself was alive. The Jewish people are far from being one monolithic ethnic group, even from its very beginnings as a nation. Before I forget, I once heard a Black Hebrew Israelite said that they don't know where white people come from. Let's get there. Let's go to Acts chapter 17. All right. It says here, and we're going to start verse 22. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things are ye too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. God that had made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Neither is worship with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. And he hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also one of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. In the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. And when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, We will hear thee again of this matter. But here it says plainly, God has made of one blood all nations of men. So where do white people come from? The same place you and I come from. All right. Jeremiah. For some reason this video is gone. Jeremiah 14:2. I believe this is Ahav Aver. Um, Jeremiah 14:2. He's got a lot of good videos on here. He's not a Messianic Jew. He's just a Jew. We were discussing about Jesus, whether he kept the Torah. He tried to say Jesus taught against the Torah when he said, when Jesus told the dead to bury their dead. But 119 Ministries has a good video on that. He wasn't teaching against the Torah. There was the two burials. One was a year later, where they went and reburied the bones. That was the second burial. He wasn't telling them don't bury your. I can't. There's a video on here where he does this on Jeremiah 14. But we'll get to the video of his here, response to his Hebrew Israelite comments, because he deals with that text with Deuteronomy 28. Let's go to the one of Moses being mistaken for an Egyptian. I'm not sure what happened to this link here. Some will cite Acts 21:38 as proof that Jews, like the Apostle Paul himself, was black. Let's take a look at the text. Acts 21:37 through 39. Let's zoom in. Can we zoom in on this? Is there on this reader? Let me see here. Zoom out. No, we don't want to zoom out. Okay, let's just read here. And Paul was to be led into the castle. He said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian, which before the days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? And Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarshish, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. The identity of Paul was mistaken with that of an Egyptian. So a Black Hebrew Israelite member will say, see, right there, it says Paul was mistaken for a black person. Pause. Let's no. It's too easy to draw that conclusion when one does not consider the Egyptian people of the first century. Egypt has been conquered many times over. Egypt had so many different dynasties rule over it over time. So Egypt has gone through changes since Moses' time. You take a look at some of the portraits that date back to the Imperial Roman era from the late 1st century or the early 1st century AD onwards here. The Fayim mummy portraits. These portraits alone tell a different story. So let's go to... So here we are. This is Wikipedia. Mummy portraits or Fayim mummy portraits are a type of naturalistic painted portrait on wooden boards attached to upper-class mummies from Roman Egypt. They belong to the tradition of panel painting, one of the most highly regarded forms of art in the classical world. The Fayim portraits are the only large body of art that tradition to have survived. They were formerly and incorrectly called Coptic portraits. Mummy portraits have been found across Egypt, but are most common in the Fayim basin, particularly from Hawara, an Hadrianic Roman city, Antinopolis. Fayim portraits is generally used as a stylistic rather than a geographic description. While painted cartoonage, mummy cases date back to pharaonic times. The Fayim mummy portraits were an innovation dating to the time of Roman rule in Egypt. Portraits date to the Imperial Roman era from the late 1st century BC or the early 1st century AD onward. It is not clear when their production ended, but some research suggests it ended in the middle of the 3rd century. They are among the largest groups among the very few survivors of the panel painting tradition of the classical world, which continued into Byzantine, Eastern Mediterranean, and Western traditions in the post-classical world, including the local tradition of Coptic Christian iconography in Egypt. The portraits covered the faces of bodies that were mummified for burial. Examples indicate that they were mounted into the bands of cloth that were used to wrap the bodies, almost all have now been detached from the mummies. They usually depict a single person showing the head or head and upper chest viewed frontally. In terms of artistic tradition, the images clearly derive more from Greco Roman artistic traditions than Egyptian ones. The groups of portraits can be distinguished by technique, one of encaustic wax paintings, the other in tempera. The former are usually of higher quality. About 900 mummy portraits are known at present. The majority were found in the necropolis of Fayum. Due to the hot, dry Egyptian climate, the paintings are frequently very well preserved, often retaining their brilliant colors, seemingly unfaded by time. So here's some of the portraits here. Where are the so-called black people that Paul looked like? That's what I'm. Where are these black people that Paul looked like? That was mistaken for an Egyptian. If these are what the Egyptians look like, Paul could have looked like any one of these males. Any one of these could have been mistaken for any one of these. This is hardly any proof text that he was a black African. Now, some of these could look more black, like this guy right here. He looks like, and maybe this guy a little bit, and this guy, just looking at the texture of their hair and stuff. But you could see that the vast majority they don't even look like that. So to say that he was black, especially knowing what the African slaves look like and comparing that to them, there's no way that this is a proof text. Okay. This is a good video here. Whoops. What happened? Kaviah King. Oh, yeah. I remember how Moses could have been mistaken for an Egyptian. Black Hebrew Israelites debunked. You can check out that video on his channel. This is from 14 years ago. Simon was called Niger. This is very simple. You can read this in Acts 13, 1 through 2. His name was Simeon, actually, but he was called Niger. So they were describing him. Niger means black. So why did they call him black? If every one of them were black, why did they call him black? Makes no sense. So if the vast majority were not dark skinned or black skinned, nicknaming him black then means something. It makes sense then why he was called Niger. They called him the dark skinned one. Now, this is not the same thing as the derogatory term we use here in English in the United States. Not the same thing. Niger is just describing a color. All right. So this is Laban. We talk about Laban. His actual name means white. Does that mean that all Leah and Rachel were white? Who knows? I don't know. I don't really know the characteristic of why they called Laban white. White could be just used for some type of distinguishing characteristic. Maybe he came out white when he first, like he was a white skin when he came out as a baby. You've seen how babies come out a certain color and then they get melanin later in life. They get darker, but they came out as like a fair skinned child. I mean, who knows? Who knows why? Because he was had to be named as a child, Laban. So we just don't know. But I just wanted to point that out because Laban is the father of Rachel and Leah. So if we're trying to make a point about Simeon being called Niger, meaning he was black, well, then what about Laban and what does that mean for Leah and Rachel? Because Laban means white. That's the main point of why we're putting that in there. Now let's deal with this text. Now, this one people get tripped up about because in Revelation chapter 1, verse 12 through 16, people want to say it says something that it's not actually saying. Is there a way I can go back on this? Is this, yeah, this is the, go back to the Bible. Revelation. I want to get this enlarged. All right. I turned to see the voice of him that spake with me, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks. Where did it just? Okay. Verse 13. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow. And his eyes were as a flame of fire. His feet like unto fine brass, as if they had burned in the furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength. Several things. This is all symbolic. First of all, what Black Hebrew Israelites wanted to focus on were his hairs were, and then they skip this word and just think it says like wool. His hairs were like wool. What it actually says is his head and his hairs were white like wool. White like wool. Wool is the color white. And then it further accentuates and says, as white as snow. So it's talking about the color of his head and his hairs. So it's not just his hairs. It's not talking about the texture of his hair. It's talking about the color. White like wool, as white as snow. But it says his hairs, but it also says his head. So it says his head was white and his hair was white. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet like unto fine brass. This is exactly the opposite of his head. Because they look like as if they've been burned in the furnace. His voice, sound of many waters. Again, this is the Son of Man. This is Jesus Christ, the Son of Man in his body, but he has 7 stars in his hand. Now, when he raised from the dead, was not Philip able to touch his hands and thrust his hand into his side? Jesus was not out of proportion. So Jesus would have to be out of proportion here to have actual stars in his hand. This is all symbolic, you guys. Totally reading this wrong. He has his mouth, out of his mouth comes a sharp 2-edged sword. People are totally reading that text altogether wrong. They're trying to make something out of the text that's not even in the text. Totally bypassing the part that it says his head and his hairs was white like wool, is white as snow. Not talking about the texture of it, talking about the color of it. You got a white head and you got brass colored feet, as if it's burned in, what did it say? Burnished in the furnace, something of that. So no, this is a post-resurrection, post-ascension, the Son of Man in heaven. What John is seeing is a lot of symbolic things. A lot of these things have meaning. I urge you to study the temple in Leviticus, and what the materials used and all that stuff symbolizes, and the symbolic meaning, as well as what the priest and their garments and what that stuff meant. And then go back and look at the risen, reigning King Messiah in Revelation chapter 1. It has nothing to do with what Black Hebrew Israelites are talking about. They are way off base here, just way off base. Some try to point to the Black Madonna and the child, but this is actually Nimrod and his mother Semiramis. These portraits, they're pagan images used in the Roman Catholic Church as a way to bring Catholic religion closer to certain populations. They'll have Black Madonnas and the child in the Black populations. They'll have dark brown Madonnas and the child in their indigenous native populations, and We can refer you to Alexander Hislop's book, The Two Babylons, that pointing to the mother and child depiction that Catholics admire and kneel down to and pray to. They are none other than the goddess mother and son of Babylonian worship. This is what this is all about. This is not, oh, the Catholic Church knows the true color of Jesus and Mary. This has nothing to do with that. Deuteronomy 32, 26, 27. I said I would scatter them into corners. I would make the remembrance of them to cease from among men. Were it not that I feared the wrath of the enemy, lest their adversaries should behave themselves strangely, unless they should say, our hand is high and the Lord hath not done all this. Basic idea here is that the Black Hebrew Israelite would lose their identity and forget they were Israelites. Because God says, I will make the remembrance of them cease from among men. God doesn't say, I will. He said, I would that. I would make the remembrance of them. And he files that with, were it not that I feared the wrath of the enemy, lest their adversaries should behave themselves strangely, and lest they should say, our hand is high, and the Lord hath not done all this. In other words, he doesn't want the nations to take credit for what has happened here. So he's not going to make the remembrance of them cease from among men. This is actually talking about God's not going to allow the utter destruction of the children of Israel, like where they cease to be a nation. So this proof text is not a proof text. Some use this to say that in a desperate attempt to say the Jews would forget they are Jews. The fact that Israel doesn't know its owner, its master, because of their rebellion. This is talking about Isaiah 1, 2 through 3. Let's pull that up. We get back to the Bible here. Isaiah 1, 2 through 3. Hear, O heavens, give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. Now, I wonder which version. Let me see what version might read a little differently. Try the NIV. The nearly inerrant version. The ox knows its you could just read it as this way. The ox knows its master. The donkey, its owner's manager. In other words, the donkey knows its owner's manger. But Israel doesn't know. In other words, its master. And my people do not understand. So they use that to say, in a desperate attempt to say the Jews would forget that they would be Jews. They'd forget their maker, forget who they were. The fact that Israel doesn't know its owner, its master, is because of the rebellion. It doesn't mean that they forgot him. It means that pretty much they're far from him. They're rebellious, and the text is in the present tense, not the future tense. As he was talking about in that moment, not some time in the future, as is read into the text by Black Hebrew Israelites. But Israel does not know. My people does not understand. In other words, it doesn't say Israel will not know its master. It's talking about the present tense. You guys don't know. You don't understand now. Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. Let's get to Deuteronomy 28:68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. Again. Into Egypt again. By the way whereof I spake unto thee. Spake is past tense. The Lord, let me read this again. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. This is different though, with ships. By the way whereof I spake, note, past tense, unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Part of this is a bad translation. And this is dealing with the you shall be sold unto your enemies. Because the text in Hebrew actually says, you shall sell yourselves unto your enemies as bondmen and bondwomen. If you don't know what a bondman and a bondwoman is, this is indentured servitude. This is not the type of chattel slavery that happened in America. And no man shall buy you. There will be no buyer. Heard someone say that means that there will be no redeemer, but that's not what the Hebrew means. So here is the most often quoted verse to prove that the Israelites were enslaved and taken by ships to Africa, and that the so-called African American is actually the offspring of Jacob. Let's point out first the less obvious, the word again, which is used twice in this text and has to be pointed out. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again. And, by the way, where have I spoken to thee? Thou shalt see it no more again. Let's look at the first usage of this word. Apparently, the Israelites had been to Egypt before for God to say that he would bring them there again. I've heard it argued that Egypt here is America. If that is true, then Egypt is symbolic, and that makes me reason that there are other parts of the text that must also be symbolic or may also be symbolic. Why is just the country of Egypt symbolic while everything else isn't symbolic? And that's not usually how the biblical text uses symbolic terms. Secondly, when Egypt is used symbolically instead of literally, it's used to symbolize the world. Pharaoh is a portrayal of the adversary, the devil. And when Israel wished to return to Egypt, the lesson it taught is how the children of God, the people of God, want to return back to their former ways, the world, and forsake God and his ways, which is the kingdom. There has never been a connotation of Egypt being used to symbolize any other country. The Passover story itself is retold as a reminder of how God delivered his people by an outstretched arm and set them free from Egyptian bondage. The Newer Testament goes on to show how it represents the believers being freed from the bondage to sin and drawn out, called out, taken out from the world unto God. From a life of worldliness, a life of sin and death, a life of slavery to and bondage to sin and death, to serve the master, to serve their king and maker. The Red Sea symbolizes, if we can use New Covenant terminology or New Covenant imagery here, baptism, which is the dying of sin and self. And then the coming up out of the waters is a picture of resurrection to newness of life, where we reckon ourselves dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God for righteousness. And that's talked about in Romans chapter 6. So certainly, I believe that interpreting Egypt as a symbol of America or any other country other than literal Egypt, or symbolically as in non-literally anything other than the representation of the world, of the former way of life, the old man, that's a new thing and has no biblical precedent. It helps to support the Black Hebrew Israelite theology, but I believe it is unfounded in Scripture. Here's a red pill. Less than 4% of the slaves in the Atlantic slave trade ended up in the U.S. At the peak, 25% of Southern farmers owned slaves. If the U.S. was built off of slavery, Central America, South America, and the West Indies should have been the most dominant, prosperous empires. Because here we got 0.5 million. We got 4.5 million slaves went to West Indies, zero point 0.3 million to Europe, 5 million to South America. We got 0.5 million over here. I don't know if that's showing 0.2 million over here. Or there's probably a number in front of that. I don't have the whole picture there. Point is of this image is only a very small number of the slaves in the slave trade actually ended up in the United States. Okay. The second time again is used is in relation to the way in which they returned to Egypt. God says, I'm going to bring you back to Egypt again, and this time by ships. By the way, that I previously informed you that you shall not see it again. Well, you must be thinking at this point, was there a time God said that they wouldn't see Egypt again, literal Egypt? And he did, in fact, tell them that. And this is actually found in Deuteronomy 17:14-16. When you enter the land the Lord your God has given you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of gold, silver, and gold. So this here, the Lord is actually talking about literal Egypt. You're not to go back that way again. You're not to see this land again. And honestly, that would have been the case had they kept following the Lord in their heart. They circumcised the foreskin of their hearts, not just of their flesh, but of their hearts as well, and followed him diligently, pursued him diligently. They would not have forsaken the Lord and went back. This passage is proof that what God meant by Egypt was actually the country of Egypt that they had left from as freed slaves. God never wanted the nation to go back to Egypt, not even for the sake of their king. This is the same Egypt that they desired after they came out of it and they were wandering in the wilderness, because at least Egypt had onions and tomatoes and meat. And it was not to be the place. This was not, however, that same Egypt was not to be the place they were to return to as a people. So here God says, don't return no more that way to Egypt. God says again in Deuteronomy 28 that the Egypt that they would return to by way of ships to the place he told them they were not to return to is the Egypt of the Bible. It is no way, shape, or form the United States of America. The curses that come because of disobedience reverse the previous blessings that had came from obedience to God. It was a blessing to have been taken out and not go back to Egypt, but the curse would come because of disobedience that would result in them literally going back into Egypt. Uh, I exhort you to read some of Josephus' works who document Israel going back into Egypt in ships. So as Josephus, a couple of his works that I can know of. One of his works that comes to the top of my head, I'm not sure if it's in this, is the Antiquities of the Jews. And then, I can't think of what the other book that's, there's another book and it doesn't come to mind. Is it The War of the Jews? Something of that nature. Josephus, he documents it. It's probably The War of the Jews. And that probably talks about it because this would have been a result of their rebellion against Rome and rising up against Rome and what Rome did as a response. Now, you may have heard that the part where it says there will be no buyer really means there will be no redeemer. But I challenge anyone to look at this passage in Deuteronomy 28:68. Use your Bible research tools such as a concordance. You can use eSword Bible software or whatever you use to study God's word and look up the Hebrew word for buyer in this specific verse. Also, look at the various other passages of scripture that use that very same Hebrew word. It means purchase or possess, buy. For example, Genesis 14 19. In Genesis 14:22, where God is referred to as the possessor of heaven and earth. He owns it. He has them. He possesses them. Genesis 33:29. And he bought a parcel of land. Exodus 21:2 usage of the term is very interesting because in it is the context of slavery. It says, if thou buy a Hebrew slave. It does not mean if you redeem a Hebrew slave. And none of this doesn't mean if you redeem. It means if you buy, if you own, if you possess. It says, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. Compare that to Exodus 6:6, where an entirely different Hebrew word is used for redeem. We don't have to deal with this text. So we dealt with slavery, how that works earlier. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm. They are entirely different Hebrew words, not the same. What you've been told about the interpretation of "but no man shall buy you" is their way of forcing the text goes against what the Hebrew word used here means, as is apparent by the term's usage. So we need to show you that in Deuteronomy 28:68, it doesn't actually say that they would be sold, but rather that they would sell themselves. So back to, I said we would come to this Ahav Avers, response to Hebrew Israelite comments. You can watch his video. Ahav Aver is his channel. Response to Hebrew Israelite comments. What it means is you shall sell yourselves. And we'll look at some rabbinic commentary on this from like Rashi and Ibn Ezra. You will offer yourselves for sale. No man will buy you. And you will be sold, i.e., by sellers other than yourself, for it adds afterwards, but no one will buy you. An overinch. It would not, however, be correct to explain in the sense of you will be sold. This is what I should have read that. It would not be correct to explain in the sense that this word means you will be sold, i.e., by sellers other than yourselves. For it adds afterwards, but no one will buy you. And ye shall sell yourselves. Does not mean and you will be sold. It means you, both men and women, will seek to sell yourselves, and no man shall buy you. So even the rabbinic commentary agrees with that. But I really strongly suggest you watch Ahav Aver's video on Deuteronomy 28:68 in his response to Black Hebrew Israelites. Back in Moses' time, selling oneself into slavery was a means of making a living. We actually discussed whole slavery concept and how that worked. Now, if you still want to believe you're a Black Hebrew Israelite, let's take a look at something in Nehemiah's time where certain individuals couldn't prove that they were of Israel, and they wanted to serve as priests, and they were rejected. This is Nehemiah chapter 7, 61 through 64. And it states, and these were they which went up also from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Emer, but they could not show their father's house, nor their seed, whether they were of Israel. The children of Delilah, I don't even know if that's not Delilah, but it's Delilah. The children of Tobiah, the children of Nekodah, 642. And the priests, the children of Habiah, children of Kaz, the children of Barzillai, which took one of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, to wife, and was called after their name. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy. They tried to go in the register alongside those that they knew were Israelites by genealogy, but it was not found. Therefore, were they as polluted, but from the priesthood. Now, I don't know exactly how proselytes are reckoned. Do they go on a particular tribe, or how that was viewed? That's an interesting thing that I would need to look up to figure out. But they do reckon them as Jews, so and they could marry other Israelites. But how that worked would be interesting to find out. I actually haven't done that research. I need to do that. But here's where Black Hebrew Israelites will close their ears at. Folks in Nehemiah's time were claiming to be of Israel, but they couldn't prove their genealogy. They weren't able to prove it. Faith that they were wasn't enough. They even tried to claim they were of Levi and thus of the priesthood, but treated as polluted, all because they couldn't prove their claim. And we got black folks on word of mouth and faith claiming they are of Israel, but they wouldn't cut it in Nehemiah's day. Many black Americans can't even name their immediate father, let alone grandfather or great grandfather. Most can, but many cannot. These had no papers or records to prove genealogy. Their word was not good enough. It's also recorded here in Ezra chapter 2, verses 60 to 62. How is it that these, only a generation or two removed, couldn't prove their genealogy, but folks today, 2 millennium removed, claim they can? And their claim is made on a faulty interpretation of Scripture. We're going to close here. Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Luke 21:24. This is often used to state that since the time of the Gentiles is not fulfilled, the Gentiles are in the land, and thus the ones calling themselves Jews in Jerusalem must be Gentiles. This is failing to realize that Gentiles still live there, and particularly the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is not free Gentiles, and the worship of Allah is still conducted there. We have the Dome of the Rock right here in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Responsibility of security of the Temple Mount is in Arab hands. Jews are only permitted to pray at the Western Wall and do not have access to the Temple Mount. The Arabs can visit their holy sites on the Temple Mount at any time that they want to, unless in emergency situations. And they are even digging there against Jewish protest, destroying archaeological treasures and building new shrines. Jerusalem is trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. All right. We're just getting into. All right. I don't want to do that. I want to undo what I just did. Block contains unexplained. I don't know what happened to the website here. Things got changed here. I challenge you to read Romans 10, 1 through 13, and see if this doesn't line up with the Jewish people today. The people that Black Hebrew Israelites say are imposters who claim they're Jews. Is this not particularly who Paul describes right here in Romans 10, 1 through 13? And also food for thought. Let's for a second assume that I'm wrong and that the Hebrews were in fact black. What makes you so sure that it's talking about your ancestors? Because Deuteronomy 28 isn't talking about the transatlantic slave trade. But what if it was? What? It's not talking about that. Well, what if they were black skinned people? And do you know there are people in India just as black, but they don't have near kin relation to our enslaved ancestors? How do we know that if they were black, they didn't just look like this? Now, how many of you would claim that you are ancestors of these dark skinned Indians? When I say Indian, I'm talking about in India, the country in the East, not Indians from North America, as opposed to looking like this. 'Cause these are all they're the same color. So even if you do believe they were black, how do you know they weren't like black closer to that or to this? I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not trying to say anything by that. Um, I also want to point out another video here. Beyond coincidence, the testimony of prophecy. Still need more evidence. Watch this video. on the web YouTube channel Testimony of Prophecy called Beyond Coincidence. This video presents 5 literal prophecies from the Bible that can only have been written by the direction of a real God who knows the end from the beginning. These prophecies are 1, East Gate sealed; 2, the return of Israel; 3, the dividing of Jerusalem; 4, the dividing Israel by the nations of the world; and 5, the Dead Sea healed by a constructive waterway being proposed today. This is 9 years old, but watch this video. It's 55 minutes long. Yeah. Jewish people are in the land today. I'm sorry, but these notions of Black Americans who came over here on slave ships are the true Jews is not what the scriptures teach. Are there Black Jews? Yes. Are African Americans in the United States what's being depicted in Deuteronomy 28:68? No. There's a difference. There is a difference. Watch that. Also, what is not often talked about is when we're dealing with people that want to be Jewish, I would challenge you to listen to where's the place series? Here we go. Audio series Galatians. This is at Beth Emanuel Messianic Synagogue, bethemanuel.org, audio series Galatians. Listen to, there's like 20 some sessions on this. 23. What he does in here is he explains, this is Daniel Lancaster, based on his book, The Epistle to the Galatians, that was produced by First Fruits of Zion. He deals with the gospel and how the book of Galatians is talking about access denied. How Gentiles don't have to convert and become Jews in order to be part of the kingdom of God. But Paul has been misconstrued to be understood to teach that the Torah was done away. And that's not what he's talking about, because his audience isn't Jews, and his audience is Gentiles. He's talking about how the Torah relates to Gentiles. I challenge you to listen to each and every one of these. Paul does not teach against the law. In fact, Jesus never taught against the law. But you can get the book form, Epistle to the Galatians, D. Thomas Lancaster. There we go. It's available on Amazon. Get the hardcover for $14.79. They got it used and new for $8.58. What about the New Covenant? You can get that. Also, highly recommend this book. They love the Torah. What Yeshua's first followers really thought about the law. These books will open your eyes. Get the Kindle version, $6.99. You can get a used or new. Cheapest one is $1.76. This is by David Friedman, PhD. I recommend these books, highly recommend, because most of the people that I've come across to personally who claim to be Jews would not be wanting to keep all the Torah. They wouldn't want to do that. And it's not incumbent upon you to keep all 613 mitzvahs in the same way that a Jew would. In that same way, as if you're not a Jew. So it would not be incumbent upon you to keep it all of that nature. But I recommend you listening to that. You can listen to a lot of Daniel Lancaster's teachings on. He's got good teachings on here. But yeah, particularly that one. Um, Listen to the audio series, and I pray that you earnestly study and pray and let God lead you and let God use you and let God remove the confusion. Because I think Black Hebrew Israelite theology has caused a lot of confusion, a lot of confusion, and it's caused a lot of anti Semitism. So, with that said, we are going to end here in this session. And that is the closing session for this particular series on the debunking the theology of the Black Hebrew Israelites. And we'll move on to something else when I upload the next podcast. God bless you and heaven smile upon you. In Jesus' name.